Hey guys, for today's video, I'll be going over the bosses in Apocalyptic Shadow to show you how to full clear. Now, considering that each difficulty is the same, this guide will apply to all difficulties. For both phases, all allies will have their crowd control effects dispelled, recover skill points, and obtain their ultimates when enemies with the steadfast safeguard have their weakness broken. For the first phase, we're gonna have Hoolay as the boss. Hoolay is characterized by the need to kill his little Hoolays to get rid of his toughness, and to prevent him from entering his Moonrage states, in which you're gonna need to target him as much as possible to remove his irate stacks, which will prevent him from doing powerful attacks. And when you kill 5 little Hoolays, the actual Hoolay will pick one of your allies to quote-unquote duel with, in which they will gain increased stats and only they can take actions. For this boss, you're gonna want to kill as many little Hoolays as possible to prevent the boss from gaining any buffs, reduce his toughness, prevent him from going into his Moonrage states, and get buffs for your own allies. But you'll want to prioritize targeting Hoolay instead of the little ones when he does enter the Moonrage states to prevent him from doing any powerful attacks and stop his Moonrage states. Although targeting the little Hoolays will still be helpful since it'll stop them from giving him more stacks. Also, whenever you enter a duel, try to pick a character with the memo sprite so that you can have an advantage in the action counts, or a character with a ton of speed and follow-up attacks. The first buff increases the damage dealt by all allies by up to 60% when consuming skill points, which is going to be really powerful for characters like Feinen, Archer, or Anaxa, especially with Sparkle, since it'll get you a ton of damage dealt very quickly. Though, you could just get away with using pretty much any other character, since any character other than Blade, Midday, or Castris uses skill points. For the other buff, it increases break damage by up to 60% when defeating enemies, and when enemies enter the battlefield, so you're gonna want to use break characters like Boothill, Rappa, or Firefly. For the other buff, it increases crit damage by 55% for 2 turns when an ally consumes their HP, which is going to be really powerful for any HP scaling characters, since they'll be able to constantly activate this buff from the very start of the battle. Characters like Blade, Midday, Castris, and Jingliu will be able to benefit from this buff. Now, even though characters that expend a lot of skill points, scale off of break, or scale off of HP are getting nice buffs here, for Hoolay, you're gonna want to use characters that attack multiple times so that you can one-shot a ton of the little Hoolays, remove all of the irate stacks for when Hoolay goes into his Moonrage states, and gain more actions during the duel. Thus, characters like Anaxa, who can attack twice and even 4 times with Ceridra, Feixiao, who has a ton of follow-up attacks, Mose, who also has a ton of follow-up attacks and buffs Feixiao, Archer, who has follow-up attacks and can spam skills, Aglaia, whose speed lets her do multiple attacks, Castris, who has a summon, Jinjuan, who also has a summon, though I wouldn't recommend using him in higher difficulties because he's fallen off a bit, Dr. Ratio, who has follow-up attacks, although I also wouldn't recommend using him in higher difficulties either because he's also fallen off, Yun-Li, who can counter attacks, Argenti, who can spam ultimate attacks, and Himeko, who is decent with the break build and also has follow-up attacks, would all be good here. For your supports, any top tier character like RMC, Trippy, Cypher, Silverwolf, Ruan-Mei, etc. would work, but some exceptionally good picks would be Robin, Sunday, and Ceridra, since Robin is incredibly powerful with follow-up attacks, Sunday is incredibly powerful with summons, and Ceridra can double actions. Also, Sparkle would be a specific pick if you're using Archer, and Hyacine, preferably with Trippy, would also be tremendously helpful for HP scaling characters. Also, Hoolay is gonna have 40% resistances against characters with ice, lightning, and imaginary damage, so make sure to use characters that either reduce resistances like Silverwolf or Trippy, or just not this type of character. For Feixiao, her boss is characterized by the fact that she takes reduced damage when she isn't weakness broken, so you're gonna want to use characters like Gallagher, Ruan-Mei, or even Anaxa to constantly be able to reduce the toughness bar. For the second phase, the same rules apply, except this time Feixiao has different summons that each take turns resonating, with one specific summon being able to debuff your allies. For this phase, you're gonna want to weakness break the resonating parts to gain buffs, but prioritize weakness breaking the Nebula Herda Devourer because that's the summon that inflicts debuffs. For the third phase, again, same concept, you're gonna want to weakness break to gain an advantage, but this time you're gonna want to do this to reduce the damage you take from her incredibly powerful attack. For the buffs in this phase, the first buff increases ultimate damage dealt by all allies by 30% and additionally increases by 30% against enemy targets in a weakness broken state, so characters that rely on their ultimates like Anaxa, Acheron, Saber, the Herda, or Feixiao would be good with this buff. The other buff states that when allies use their basic attacks or skills to attack weakness broken enemies, all dots currently applied to the enemies will immediately deal damage equal to 15% of the original damage, so characters that do dot damage like Black Swan, Kafka, or Hyseland would be good here. And the third buff states that after the character in position 1 in the team uses their ultimates, their weakness break efficiency increases by 50% and their crit damage also increases by 50%, lasting for one turn, which I feel is pretty obvious that this buff is meant for Feinen since the buffs only last for one turn, and it's after a character uses their ultimate, but still, any main DPS that is using a hyper carry team and relies on their ultimate will be good for this buff. So for your teams, you're gonna want to use characters that can inflict a ton of weakness break. Characters that have follow-up attacks, have break efficiency, or have a ton of speed will be good here. Characters like Feixiao, who has a follow-up attack, Anaxa, who has a follow-up attack and can do a ton of bounce damage, and reduce the toughness of either one opponent by a ton, or reduce the toughness of all opponents by a decent amount. Mo's, who can do up to 4 follow-up attacks in around 2 cycles, and maybe even 1 cycle if you're running a ton of follow-up attack characters. Archer, who with Sparkle can spam around 3 skills. Castris, who can destroy the toughness of a ton of opponents and do a ton of bounce damage like Anaxa with her ultimate. Feinen, who although is pretty broken and can do a ton of bounce damage with both his skill and follow-up attack, is actually pretty slow, so even though you could use him here, you'll probably face a couple of issues in comparison to other characters. Aglaia will also be good here since her speed is insane, which will allow her to do multiple attacks. Saber will also be good here because her ultimate does a ton of bounce damage, and break characters like Rappa, Boothill, and Firefly would also be good here. For supports, characters with advanced forward or follow-up attacks like Tribby with the Triple D Light Cone, Sunday, Bronya, Sparkle, RMC, Hyacinth, Aventurine, Linksha, and Robin will also be good here, and characters that increase break efficiency like Ruan Mei would also be good. Also, this boss is gonna have 40% resistances to ice, wind, and imaginary damage, so make sure to use characters that either reduce resistances or just don't do this type of damage. So now that I've explained each boss and have recommended characters and teams, I would recommend using some characters in one phase rather than the other one. For example, for the first phase, I would recommend using Anaxa and Robin because the two of them are insanely powerful at quickly dishing out attacks, which will stop Hoolay from being in his Moonrage states. Not only that, but Anaxa can skip one of Hoolay's additional actions through his ultimate. I would also recommend using Archer in the first phase because even though he can spam skills, his skills are only single target, so once he breaks an enemy's weakness, he can't go onto the other enemy and break them as well. I'd also recommend to use Feinen in the first phase against Hoolay since his bounce damage will be better off in single target scenarios, and Hoolay's Moonrage states doesn't really matter since Feinen can just tank with his counter stance. For Saber, I would recommend using her in the first phase since the second phase has wind resistances. For the Herda, I would honestly recommend to be used in the second phase since the first phase doesn't have that many enemies in comparison to the second phase. For break characters, I would honestly recommend to be used in the second phase as well since even though the first phase gives them 60% break damage, weakness breaking enemies is far more important in the second phase. For Blade, I would recommend using him in the first phase since the second phase has wind resistances. Same thing for Jingliu because you'll probably be using Tribby and Hyacinth there since Castris, Medei, and the Herda are also better for the second phase, and Anaxa, Aglaia, and Feinen want Sunday and either Robin, Bronya, or RMC and Huohuo for the first phase. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have anything to say, please leave it down in the comments below. I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.